Hello, I'm Joey and this is Game of Authors. Today I'm going to do a tag that's been going around called the Books That Steve Hasn't Read tag, and it was created by Matthew at Mayberry Book Club. And so the idea is to pick 10 books off your shelf, or the 10 books that you've read that hopefully to try and test to see if Steve Donoghue has read how many of these books that he has read. And Steve Donoghue is a well-known booktuber who has read a lot of books. And so I am going to do a unique twist on this in that I'm going to do the Books Steve Hasn't Read Indiana Authors Edition. So I'm picking 10 books, all of which I have read. Well, I've read 9.5 of these books. One of them I didn't finish, and they're all by Indiana authors. And 4 of the books I own, but the other 5 I had to get from the library, and one of them I couldn't get a copy of, but it's a book I've read online. So we will start with the first book that I want to see if Steve has read, which I have a feeling he probably has, but there's a reason I chose this one, and it is called Standing Firm by former Vice President Dan Quayle. So Steve, have you read Standing Firm by Dan Quayle? The reason I chose this book is because I used to do a lot of thrift book shopping at Goodwills around the central Indiana area. Indianapolis area, and I found that without exception 95% of the time, so I guess most of the time, every Goodwill I went to would always have 2 particular books, and one of them was Standing Firm by Dan Quayle, and the other one was A Season on the Brink by John Feinstein, which is a year with Bobby Knight in the Indiana Hoosiers. And it amazed me that no matter what Goodwill I went to, I always saw these 2 books on the shelf. So, which tells me that these 2 books were incredibly popular in Indiana when they first came out, and 20 years later, a lot of people are unloading both books at the local thrift store. So, anyhow, the first book I'm curious if Steve has read is Standing Firm. This was published in 1994 by Dan Quayle. I think when he was, maybe hopeful to go for a presidential run at the time this book came out. But I don't recall that he ever ended up running for president, or if he did, I don't think he got very far in the nomination. The second book that I am wondering if Steve has read is Ramsey Mulholland by Booth Tarkington. Booth Tarkington was an incredibly popular Indiana author in the first half of the 1900s. He was very prolific. He wrote books about every 1 or 2 years for about 40 years, from like 1900 to 1940. He was constantly having books come out. And being that prolific, some of his books are excellent, and some are, not at the same level. He wrote 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, Magnificent Ambersons and Alice Adams, which are both excellent books. This one came out in between those 2 books, so this was at the peak of his popularity. Ramsey Mulholland is a book about Ramsey is a college-age boy, and kind of his story with interesting girls and things going on at college. And it was right at the time. I believe a lot of it was related to World War I, which was happening at the time as well. I think it was 1919, so 100 years ago that this one came out. So wondering if Steve has read Ramsey Mulholland by Booth Tarkington. Really enjoyed this book. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is the one book that I only read about half of. I never finished it. I might finish it someday, but I haven't so far. Let's see here. The third book I'm wondering if Steve has read is Riley Love Lyrics by James Whitcomb Riley. This was originally published in 1899. I think this version might be 1905 or a few years after that. James Whitcomb Riley was an incredibly popular poet in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He's known as the Hoosier poet, but he was also, in a sense, could have even been considered the American poet. He was so popular of a poet around the country. I believe he was even invited to read his poetry at a couple of the presidential inaugurations. So he was just incredibly popular. This book specifically is poems dealing with the subject of love or romance. Very good book that I thoroughly enjoyed. I've read a lot of James Whitcomb Riley. Just wondering if Steve has read Riley Love Lyrics. All right, so that was number 3. Number 4 is a book by a friend of mine This is called Kiriath's Quest. It came out in 2008 by Rick Barry, another Indiana author, someone I know here who used to live here locally. And this is a book I read to my kids several years when they were much younger. It's a fantasy book. It's you know, it's thinner, but it's kind of, you know, I don't read much fantasy, so in my mind I'm comparing it to Lord of the Rings, but that's probably because that's, you know, about the only one of the only other fantasy books that I've read. But I think it's kind of designed, you know, in that way. So anyhow, just wondering if Steve has read Kiriath's Quest by Rick Barry, another Indiana author. Let's see here. Okay, so those are the ones I own. Now some of the ones I had to get from the library, but I have read all of these. So number 5 is Hoosier Holiday by Theodore Dreiser. Dreiser, another incredibly popular author in the early 1900s, first half of the 20th century. Dreiser wrote Sister Carrie. He wrote An American Tragedy, some excellent fiction. This is actually nonfiction, and this book is a delightful travelogue that was written in 1916, and it's about a trip, a road trip that he and I think it was Franklin Booth, I believe that's the name, a well-known artist at the time. The two of them took a road trip from New York City back to Indiana, and it was Dreiser's first trip back to Indiana in many years, and he had moved a lot as a child, so he went back to all of the places he had lived in his childhood in Indiana. And I think what's so fascinating about it is how different a road trip was in 1914 than it is today. How many times they had to, you know, stop to replace the tire, or, you know, the roads they were driving on, dirt roads, no highways, no interstates certainly, but even very few paved roads even. But just the way Dreiser writes about the people he encountered, it was very, very interesting book to read. So I'm wondering if Steve has read Hoosier Holiday by Theodore Dreiser. Let's see here. Number 6 is The Bears of Blue River by Charles Major. This came out in 1901. Charles Major was another best-selling author in probably 1900s, maybe 1910s. He wrote a book called When Knighthood Was in Flower, which was very, very popular, and it's referenced in the movie A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, when Francie goes into the library to check out a book, and the librarian recommends to her the book When Knighthood Was in Flower, which was written by Indian author Charles Major. Now this book, which I'm wondering if Steve has read, is a set of, there were 2 books that Major wrote about a character named Balzer, a young boy who lives in the pioneer times in Indiana, and you know, and hunts with his father. And there's a lot of stories about bears, which were common at the time, and other animals as well. There's The Bears of Blue River, and the second book is called Uncle Tom, Andy Bill. And I read both of these books to my boys and when they were younger, and we really enjoyed them. The boys enjoyed them. So just wondering if Steve has read The Bears of Blue River by Charles Major. Let's see. Okay. This book was written in 2006 by Ray Boomhauer. It is called The Soldier's Life. The Soldier's Friend, A Life of Ernie Pyle. So this is a biography of Ernie Pyle, who's an Indiana writer, and it's written by Ray Boomhauer, who is also an Indiana writer. Boomhauer has written a number of excellent books on Indiana history and people from Indiana. But this one I really enjoyed reading about the life of Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle was one of the, perhaps the most popular journalists during World War II. He wrote human interest stories about soldiers and sailors and people who were fighting in the war, both in England and America, mostly America, you know, the American military that were over there. And he was writing human interest stories and sending them back to our newspapers. And he was killed right at the end of World War II. About a month or 2 before the war ended in the Pacific. He was right in the middle of the action, and unfortunately he was killed. But a fabulous book here, The Soldier's Friend, A Life of Ernie Pyle by Ray Boomhauer. Just wondering if Steve has read this one. Number 8, the book I'm wondering if Steve has read is called Shade of the Raintree The Life and Death of Ross Lockridge Jr., and this is by his son Larry Lockridge. This was written in 1994. It was written by Larry Lockridge about the life of and death of his father Ross. And Ross Lockridge had written the best-selling book Raintree County that was later made into a movie about 10 years after the book came out. And after Lockridge's death was when the movie came out. But Ross Lockridge only ever wrote one book, Raintree County. Here's a picture of him on the back of the book. And in fact, I think this is the first edition of the book, I believe. And Lockridge wrote this one book, and then he committed suicide. And that's what this book is about. It's his son. It's pretty thick, and it was very, very enjoyable, very well done, tracing his father's childhood and his literary career. His father was a professor at Indiana University. He worked a long time on Raintree County. He kind of viewed it as perhaps trying. I think he was attempting to write the great American novel in Raintree County. And so anyhow, Larry Lockridge did a great job here in writing the story of his father in that book. Just wondering if Steve has read this book, Shade of the Raintree by Larry Lockridge. Number 9 is this book here. It's called From Ben-Hur to Sister Carrie by Barbara Olenyik Morrow. And it is remembering the lives and works of 5 Indiana authors. This one came out in 1995. And the 5 authors that are talked about in this book are Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur, one of the best-selling books of the 1800s, and James Whitcomb Riley, who we talked about, Booth Tarkington, Theodore Dreiser, we talked about, and then the 5th one is Gene Stratton Porter, who was a very popular nature writer and also fiction writer in the early 1900s. She wrote A Girl of the Limberlost and Freckles, and other popular fiction books. But anyhow, just wondering if Steve has read From Ben-Hur to Sister Carrie. When I first became interested in Indiana authors, I checked this one out, and it was excellent. It was very informative and just really, really interesting. And these authors, while these are Indian authors, some of which are not real well known today, at their time they weren't known as just Indian authors. I mean, Tarkington, Whitcomb Riley, Lew Wallace, these were America's authors. They just happened to be from Indiana. But great book here. And then the last book I want to ask if Steve has read is, which I don't have a copy of. I think it only was printed in one edition. It's called The Dark and the Damp. It came out in 1951, and it's by Jock Wilson. And it might be my favorite book on the list. Jock Wilson was a professor at the University of Michigan, and he wrote this autobiography. It was published by E.P. Dutton, so it has a Kirkus review you can look up online. So while it only came out in one edition, and I can't get a copy of it, I read it online at the Open Library website. I feel like it's fair to put this on the list because it was published by a national publisher at the time. It just has never been reprinted. It's a wonderful autobiographical book about his life growing up in small town Indiana and how he had to go to work in the coal mines at age 9. And he worked at the coal mines for I want to say it was about 4 years, from like age 9 to 13, or it might have been 13 to 17. I can't remember. I might be off on the time frame there. Yeah, it might be maybe 13 to 17 or 12 to 16, something like that. But giving up school, this was a boy who loved learning, loved reading, and how he had to give up school because of a sickness in the family, give up school, go to work with his father, working in the mines. And this was written in 51, but it was about his life in the 19-teens or 1900s, and it was one of the best books I've ever read in describing what life in the mines was like in those early years. For example, he talks about pulling the donkey or the mule onto the elevator and then heading down, so many feet below ground with this donkey and they don't have flashlights. They have like these carbine lamps and I'm not even sure I understand what that is exactly, but these very flammable lamps that they have on their hats, or they carry them, so just so primitive that, it never occurred to me that they would carry mules and donkeys down with them into the ground, but they had to have them to pull the carts. And just think about the stink from the mules and everything. But that's just one part of it. He's very descriptive. He was an excellent writer. And unfortunately, the book probably didn't sell well, which is why he probably didn't write any more books. But it's not because it wasn't a good book. It was an excellent read. One of my favorite reads the year that I read that. He also wrote one other book of poetry. He was known as the coal miner's poet. But anyhow, it's The Dark and the Damp by Jock Wilson, written in 1951. Just wondering if Steve has read that one. By the way, it did win the 1951 Avery Hopwood Award in Literature from the University of Michigan. So those are my 10 books by Indiana writers. Just wondering, Steve, how many of those books you've read. And thanks to Matthew for creating this tag. And hopefully, Steve, thank you for hopefully answering the tag as you've been doing with some of the other ones. I would appreciate if you do. So thank you so much for watching. Bye.